The Holy Bible is one of the most important documents in human history, and putting it like that, it's probably worth knowing what's actually inside. Whether you're religious or not, you may be familiar with at least some of its stories. From Noah's Ark to the life of Jesus, these epic tales are at the heart of the world's largest faiths. But how well do you know the Bible? What happens in each individual book? Well, that's where I come in. In this video, let's explore the complete story of the Bible, one book at a time. Before we get started, a quick but important disclaimer. With this guide, I'm not here to push forward a particular religious viewpoint or agenda. Instead, my interest is mainly in the history of the Bible. As I go through the Bible's canonical books, I want to explain the contents and major themes of each story, while exploring the real-life historical events behind these writings. And I'll do so through the many artworks the Bible has inspired. Many of them are seen to be the greatest paintings in art history. Oh, and one final thing. Since the Bible is truly massive, I sadly won't be able to cover every single detail. There are some parts that I'll have to pass over. Well, except for the Passover story. That's staying in. And with that, let's embark on our biblical saga. The Old Testament. The Book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And with these opening lines, our story begins. The book of Genesis is the first book of the Bible, which explores the history of the Jewish people. But let's begin with the creation story and the start of, well, everything. The Bible doesn't say what came before this point. All that we do know is that there was God, a supreme cosmic deity, who speaks the universe into existence over a period of 6 days. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. After creating the stars, seas, and wild animals, God then makes a being to rule over them. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. After this busy first week of work, God is understandably a little tired and decides to rest on day 7. The creation story is one of the most famous sections of the Bible, but while it appears first in the narrative, it was likely written relatively late in the Bible's history. As we shall see, some of the oldest material in the Bible is found elsewhere. The creation story in Genesis may reflect earlier myths from the ancient Near East, such as the Enuma Elish, a Babylonian epic in which the god Marduk defeats the chaos monster Tiamat and forms the world from her body. But where those myths involve conflict and warfare, the Bible's creation story is surprisingly peaceful and pictures a world in perfect harmony. Well, for a time at least. The book then tells a second creation story. In it, God forms man from the dust of the ground and breathes life into him. God names him Adam, which is derived from the Hebrew word for ground, Adamah. Adam is to rule creation, but no animals among him are his equal. So God puts him into a deep sleep, and from his side forms a woman. Her name is Eve, which means life. The two live in a beautiful garden known as Eden, a wondrous paradise of earthly delights. Through the garden flow the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, which today can be found in modern-day Iraq. As the couple wander through Eden, God allows Adam and Eve to do as they wish, and to eat from any tree, except for one. You must not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die. Perhaps you know what happens next. You see, it isn't long for a talking snake to tempt Eve to eat the fruit, promising that she will be like God himself. Despite her initial hesitation, Eve eats from the fruit, and with it, her eyes are opened. I'm sure you've seen this depicted in Christian art, but did you know that these depictions aren't entirely accurate to the original story? Firstly, the fruit is never actually identified as an apple. That idea comes from a Latin wordplay between malus, meaning evil, and malum, which is apple. Instead, the fruit might have actually been a pomegranate, an ancient symbol of knowledge and fertility, which appears frequently in the Bible. Secondly, many have also assumed that the snake must be Satan, but this idea was largely popularized through works like Paradise Lost in the 1600s. In the original story, the snake is never explicitly named and may just be a talking serpent. Regardless, Adam eats the fruit as well, and suddenly the couple both realize their nakedness, and it isn't long for God to discover their shame. Because of their disobedience, God curses humanity with hardship and banishes Adam and Eve from the garden. They cannot return, for a cherub wielding a flaming sword now guards the gate. Despite only existing for a few days, Adam and Eve have managed to royally mess things up for the rest of us. And the remainder of the Bible follows God's attempt to restore this broken relationship. But for the time being, things are about to get a whole lot worse. Out in the wilderness, Adam and Eve have two sons, whom they call Cain and Abel. One day, the brothers decide to make a sacrifice to honor God. While Cain offers crops, God seems to prefer Abel's offering of meat. Overcome with jealousy, Cain attacks his brother, killing him. Despite this being the first murder in history, God decides to spare Cain and places a mark on his face, condemning him to wander aimlessly across the earth. Despite Eve being the only woman mentioned in our story, humanity begins to multiply and spread across the earth. In these early days, people are said to have lived much longer than today. For example, Adam is said to have lived for 930 years, while his descendant Methuselah reached the age of 969, making him the oldest human in the entire Bible. As the humans begin to spread, so too does their wickedness and violence, especially after a group of renegade angels decide to mate with human women and produce a cursed race of giant offspring known simply as the Nephilim. Watching this debacle unfold from above, God quickly begins to regret creating humanity, and so he plans to destroy his creation with a great flood. But he decides to make one exception, a man called Noah and his family. God commands Noah to build a great boat known as an ark, and to gather two of every animal inside. Soon, God sends down the rain, and the earth is engulfed by the waters. All those left behind are swept away. After 40 days and nights, the waters begin to recede, and the ark comes to rest on Mount Ararat. Shortly after exiting the ark, Noah performs an animal sacrifice, presumably ending one entire species there and then. Anyway, God promises never to flood the earth again, and seals his covenant with a rainbow. The story of Noah's Ark is another one of the Bible's greatest hits. It too has ancient parallels. A very similar flood myth appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Tablet 11 tells the story of a man called Utnapishtim who builds a great boat to escape a divine flood. In some versions of this myth, it's because the humans were making too much noise down below. Nowadays, scholars believe that the story of Noah's Ark must have been connected to other flood myths found across the region, tales that may even preserve the mythological memory of an actual historical event. In the years after Noah, humanity begins to recover, and soon the first towns and cities begin to emerge across the earth. The greatest of these is Babel, where humans decide to work together and construct a colossal tower, one that is so large that it begins to reach the heavens themselves. Seeing their ambition and fearing what they could achieve if they worked together, God thwarts the builders by confusing their language. Soon, the project descends into chaos, and the people scatter across the earth. The story of the Tower of Babel concludes the first section of the book of Genesis, which describes the turbulent years of the primordial world. The remaining chapters take place years later and introduce us to the ancestors of the Jewish people. In the early days of human civilization, one of the first true cities to develop was Ur in southern Mesopotamia. Surviving clay tablets describe a bustling city with all sorts of people, from tax collectors to shady copper merchants. But according to the Bible, one of its most famous inhabitants was a man called Abram. In the story, God speaks to Abram and promises him that he will become a father of a great nation, and his name will be a blessing among all people. Abram is told to leave Ur and journey to the land of Canaan, where his descendants will one day settle. And so, Abram travels west to the Promised Land. During their travels, a number of stories unfold, including how Abram's nephew, Lot, escaped the violent destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. According to the story, the inhabitants of the city attempted to assault a pair of visiting angels. As punishment, the city is engulfed in flames. Many perish, including Lot's wife, who looks back at the burning city and is turned into a pillar of salt. Once Abram arrives in Canaan, God renews his promise with him and changes his name to Abraham, meaning father of many nations. Shortly after, God tells Abraham that he and his descendants must be circumcised as a sign of this covenant. Speaking of offspring, God promises Abraham's wife, Sarah, a child. To this, they both burst into laughter. After all, they're in their 90s, but miraculously, Sarah becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son, Isaac, whose name means laughter. But that was all to change. You see, when the boy grows older, God decides to test Abraham. He commands him to sacrifice Isaac atop a mountain, to which Abraham unquestioningly agrees. But at the last moment, an angel stops him and a ram is sacrificed instead. It's a rather unsettling story, but one that demonstrates Abraham's unwavering faithfulness to God. In Judaism, this event is known as the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac. Despite his traumatic childhood experience, Isaac grows up and fathers two sons, Esau and Jacob. Although Esau is physically stronger, Jacob is more cunning. In one story, Jacob deceives his elderly father Isaac by dressing up as Esau and tricks him into giving him the blessing meant for his brother. Esau is understandably enraged, and Jacob flees to the countryside. During his time on the run, Jacob dreams of a great ladder, with angels traveling to and from the earth. It is during this strange dream that God tells Jacob that he will be the ancestor of his chosen people. In another story, Jacob spends a night by a river and encounters a mysterious figure who wrestles with him until dawn. As the sun rises, the unknown figure dislocates Jacob's hip. After this bizarre encounter, Jacob is given a new name, Israel, understood to mean one who wrestles with God. In the following chapters, Jacob reconciles with his brother Esau and then starts a family of his own. But of his 12 sons, Jacob's favorite is Joseph, his youngest. In an act of pure favoritism, Jacob gives Joseph a special cloak of many colors. This infuriates his brothers, who tear up the cloak and sell Joseph into slavery, which is classic sibling behavior. Joseph is taken south into the land of Egypt, and while he is there, he makes use of his special talent, the ability to interpret dreams. His gift eventually earns him a place at Pharaoh's court, where he even manages to foresee a coming famine. Unfortunately, Joseph's family are badly affected by the lack of food and travel down to Egypt seeking grain. When they arrive, Joseph recognizes them and after a few shenanigans, eventually reveals his identity to his brothers. After the brothers make up, Jacob's entire family leaves the Promised Land and settles in Egypt. And it's here where the book of Genesis draws to a close. From the creation of the world itself to the lives of the patriarchs of Israel, Genesis contains some of the most beloved stories in the Bible. And these tales all have one thing in common. They explain the origin of things, which is, in fact, the meaning of the word Genesis. In their original context, these stories were likely read out loud. So, in honor of this, I've created an audiobook series on my Patreon where I'll read passages from the Bible, starting with Genesis. The Book of Exodus. The word Exodus means the way out and tells the story of how the Jewish people escaped slavery in Egypt. The man that led them is one of the most important figures in the entire Old Testament, and his name is Moses. After the days of Joseph, the people of Israel begin to settle in Egypt, and true to God's promise to Abraham, their numbers begin to increase rapidly. But as the Israelite population multiplies, the ruling Pharaoh becomes afraid, fearing that one day they might revolt and take his kingdom. And so he enslaves them. To keep their numbers low, he orders for the sporadic killing of Hebrew infants. One of the few babies to survive is Moses, who is spared when his mother places him in a reed basket and sends him down the Nile. Against all odds, the basket arrives at Pharaoh's daughter, who adopts the child and raises him in the royal court. Moses grows up to be a great prince, but is largely sheltered from the suffering of the outside world. But one day, he witnesses a Hebrew slave being beaten by an Egyptian overseer. Consumed with rage, Moses kills the Egyptian and flees to the desert of Midian. Years later, we find Moses living with a new family, working as a shepherd for his father-in-law. One day, while attending his flock by Mount Horeb, Moses notices a burning bush, but strangely, it is not consumed by the fire. Then, suddenly, a voice calls out to him. It is God, who tells Moses that he is not forgotten about the suffering of his people. God commands Moses to return to Egypt and rescue them. But Moses is unsure and questions God whether he is the right man for this task. Asking God what he should say when the people ask who sent him, God replies with this enigmatic line: I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. To this day, no one can fully agree on what this phrase means. Some say that the Hebrew letters are closely related to God's personal name, Yahweh, a name often considered to be too holy to be spoken aloud. Moses returns to Egypt and with his brother Aaron demands that Pharaoh release the people of Israel. Pharaoh denies his request and instead increases the enslaved people's workload, an act that will unleash disastrous consequences. Through Moses, God sends 10 plagues upon the people of Egypt. First, the river Nile turns to blood, which is followed by a plague of frogs, gnats, flies, pestilence, boils, hail, locusts, and then total darkness. But the 10th plague is the worst of them all. Moses tells the Hebrews to mark their doors with the blood of a lamb in order to spare their households from the, quote, destroyer. That night, God passes over Egypt and spares the homes that have been marked. For the homes that remain unmarked, the life of the firstborn child is claimed. Shortly after the devastation of the 10 plagues, Moses orders the Hebrews to flee from Egypt. They leave in such a hurry that even their loaves of bread have no time to rise by morning. Despite the head start, Pharaoh gathers together his army to pursue the people. They are chased to the Red Sea, which blocks their path to escape. But then Moses stretches out his hand and the waters miraculously part, allowing a route to safety. Once the final person makes it through, the waters close behind them, drowning Pharaoh and his many chariots. Having made it to the other side, the people start to celebrate and sing songs of thanks to God. This includes Moses' sister, Miriam, who describes God as a warrior who vanquishes his enemies. I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. Known as the Song of the Sea, this hymn is believed to be one of the oldest passages in the Bible and possibly dates as far back as the Bronze Age. The language is highly archaic and is far more ancient in style than the surrounding passages. It's as if you're reading Shakespeare and it suddenly shifts to Beowulf. Having made it to the other side, the Israelites stop at Mount Sinai, where God calls Moses to the summit. There, Moses is given 2 tablets, upon which are etched the 10 Commandments, 10 sacred laws that establish the bedrock of God's relationship with his chosen people. And the first commandment is the most important of them all. You shall have no other gods before me. This famous line has often been seen as establishing monotheism, the idea of one single God. Having received the Ten Commandments, Moses descends the mountain, eager to impart God's law to his chosen people. But while he was away, the Hebrews have been, well, misbehaving. In their excitement, they have created a golden calf and have even begun to worship it. In doing so, they have broken the second commandment, which forbids idol worship. Enraged, Moses smashes the stone tablets on the ground and then treks back up Mount Sinai to humbly ask God for a copy. Despite this incident, Moses leads the Hebrews through the desert, and their journey to the Promised Land truly begins. Following a pillar of fire and smoke sent by God, the people build a sacred tent known as the Tabernacle, where God's presence is said to dwell among the people. Inside the tent is a golden chest, the Ark of the Covenant. Built to house the Ten Commandments, it is described with extraordinary detail. In later stories, it is even said to be a powerful weapon. The Book of Leviticus. If you attempt to read the Bible from end to end, I think the book of Leviticus will be the first major obstacle. So far, it's been action-packed storytelling, but now we get into a very dry subject, the law. You see, while Moses was atop Mount Sinai, there were more laws than just the Ten Commandments. In fact, God gave Moses 613 of them in total, and nearly half of them are in this book. Leviticus is a massive collection of rules, from which burnt offerings are appropriate for God to how to observe holy days. While wading through all of them might seem like an arduous task, these laws give us a glimpse into the religion of ancient Israel. Many of these rules are for the priestly class, the Levites, and so Leviticus may have been a handbook for those working at the ancient Jewish temple. Of course, much of this book contains rules and regulations designed for the wider population, from not eating foods like pork to keeping meat and milk separate. Today, many Orthodox Jews still endeavour to live by these ancient commandments. While some view them as restrictive, others view these holy laws as a sacred duty. After all, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. The Book of Numbers. Have you ever wondered why the fourth book of the Bible is called the Book of Numbers? Well, it's because it starts with a great census of all those that fled Egypt, including around 600,000 men of fighting age. The Book of Numbers follows what happened during the many years spent wandering the desert, and especially how divisions began to emerge among the Israelite tribes. After years of walking, the people soon begin to complain that they are tired, and one man called Korah leads a rebellion against Moses. In response, the earth swallows them up, and any survivors are consumed by a great fire sent from heaven. In another story, God is so frustrated with the people's faithlessness that he decrees that not a single person who left Egypt shall enter the Promised Land. As a result, the people must wander the desert for 40 years and wait for the previous generation to die out. The Book of Numbers is the "Are we there yet?" book of the Bible. And just like Shrek, it also features a talking donkey. Despite the people's many years of aimlessly wandering the desert, there is hope that one day they will arrive at the Promised Land. In fact, 12 spies are sent out to scout the lands ahead, and they soon discover that they are close to their destination. However, it is already inhabited by various hostile tribes, including the gigantic Nephilim. In order to take the land for themselves, they are going to have to defeat these people in combat. The Book of Deuteronomy. After decades of wandering the desert, a new generation of Israelites are finally ready to enter the Promised Land. But before they do so, a very old Moses addresses his people. Over a series of speeches, Moses imparts his final wisdom, including this prayer. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Known as the Shema, it is a foundational prayer in Judaism. The remainder of this book contains additional commandments that God gives to his people, and that's why it's called Deuteronomy, which means second law. What follows are more rules for the Jewish people, including one that I suspect you've heard of before: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Curiously, laws like these are not unique to the Bible. A very similar line appears in the much older Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest legal documents in history. It seems that the Bible echoes these ancient legal rulings and portrays God like an ancient king, proclaiming his laws to his subjects. After the final commandments are given, Moses delivers a farewell sermon to his people. He warns them that their future survival depends on their obedience to God. If they remain faithful, there will be blessings, but if they abandon him, there will be disaster. And after that ominous warning, the Israelites proceed toward the promised land. But Moses is left behind, as he is part of the generation that is not permitted to enter. And so, on the plains of Moab, God's faithful servant finally dies. The Book of Joshua. Let's move on to our next collection in the Old Testament, which tell the story of the history of the ancient kingdom of Israel. The Book of Joshua tells the events of the conquest of Canaan and is perhaps one of the most violent books in all the Old Testament, like the infamous Battle of Jericho. As the Israelites arrive at the city, they seem unable to breach its defenses. God tells the army to march around the city walls, carrying the Ark of the Covenant. They do this 7 times, while 7 priests blow horns. When the final horn sounds, the city walls collapse, and the army rushes inside. They devoted the city to the Lord, and destroyed with every sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. One by one, the Canaanite cities fall. From a modern perspective, these passages can be quite difficult to read, especially as they describe the destruction of entire populations of people. The Book of Judges. Once the Israelites settle in the Promised Land, they spread out into 12 tribes, each one named after the 12 children of Jacob. But while they are back in the land of their ancestors once more, the trouble is far from over. The Book of Judges describes a chaotic and brutal period in Israel's biblical history, where rival kingdoms threaten the survival of God's chosen people. In times of crisis, the tribes would band together and appoint a judge, a chieftain who would lead the Israelites against their enemies. One famous judge is Gideon, who leads an army of 300 warriors against a far larger Midianite army, making him the Jewish equivalent of the Spartan king Leonidas. But perhaps the most well-known character is Samson, a man of immense strength. From wrestling a lion with his bare hands to defeating a Philistine army with only a donkey's jawbone, Samson seemed invincible, and yet he had a single weakness: his hair, the very source of his strength. In one story, Samson is tricked by a Philistine woman called Delilah, who cuts his hair, allowing for him to be captured. He is then blinded and enslaved in the Philistine temple. As his hair grows back, Samson performs one final act of defiance. He pushes the temple pillars, bringing the building down upon his enemies and himself. The Book of Judges contains some of the most brutal stories in the Bible, like the tale of Jephthah, who, after a victory against the Ammonites, vows to sacrifice the very first thing he sees when he gets home, and that's when his own daughter runs to greet him. The Book of Ruth. Alright, it's been a little heavy so far. Time for a more uplifting story. Introducing Ruth, one of the few books named after a woman. Set during the chaotic time of Judges, it tells the story of a Moabite woman who falls upon tough times and becomes a refugee. In her desperation, she travels with her mother-in-law, Naomi, to the Israelite town of Bethlehem. Despite being a foreign worker in the land, she is accepted by the community and takes a job as a farm worker. Her devotion impresses the townsfolk, including a man called Boaz, whom she later marries. Soon, they have a child together called Obed, who will be the grandfather of one of Israel's greatest kings. The Book of Ruth is a pretty short but uplifting story, one about loyalty, kindness, and the power of second chances. The First Book of Samuel. In the Louvre Museum in Paris, you will find a large black tablet known as the Mesha Stele. Inscribed on the stone is a report that the Moabite god Chemosh is angry with his people, who have been subjugated by the kingdom of Israel. It is the earliest known mention of Israel from an external source, and seems to confirm events as described in the following books. The two books of Samuel chart the rise of the kingdom of Israel, and at its center lies the story of one of its greatest rulers, David. Amid the chaos and warfare during the time of the Judges, the people cry out for a king to unite the 12 tribes, and that's where we meet the prophet Samuel, who is tasked by God with finding Israel's next king. Samuel chooses a man called Saul, a charismatic leader and powerful warrior who soon manages to repel Israel's enemies. But God's favor in him is short-lived. In one story, Saul spares the king of the Amalekites, despite God's command to destroy them completely. God disapproves of Saul's final act of mercy, and so sends an evil spirit to afflict him. God then returns to the prophet Samuel and instructs him to find another king in secret. That's when he comes across a boy called David, whom he anoints with oil. In ancient Hebrew culture, the title of Anointed One holds special significance, especially as it comes from the word Messiah. In the following chapters, David becomes a member of King Saul's royal court, serving as the harp player to the monarch. But he also proves himself to be a capable warrior and slays the giant Goliath using only a slingshot. After this, Saul becomes increasingly jealous of David. Eventually, Saul grows impatient and tries to murder David outright, forcing him to go on the run. As David goes into hiding, Saul is once again tormented by an evil spirit from God, and his mind begins to unravel, a condition that only worsens when the Philistine armies return. In his desperation, Saul travels to the mysterious witch of Endor and asks her to summon the spirit of Samuel. When the ghost of Samuel appears, it does not offer guidance. Instead, it foretells Saul's imminent defeat. When the time for battle comes, Saul is wounded in battle, but decides to fall on his own sword to avoid capture. And with the king's death, the throne is open for a new ruler. The Second Book of Samuel. This story explores the reign of King David, often seen as Israel's greatest ruler. But interestingly, when you look at the details of his rule, the Bible doesn't paint him as a hero. Actually, far from it. Upon ascending to the throne, David establishes Jerusalem as his nation's capital. To consecrate his kingdom, he brings the Ark of the Covenant to the city, and as a sign of his approval, God makes a covenant with David that his dynasty will endure forever. But as with his predecessor Saul, David's good favor is short-lived. You see, the king has an affair with a married woman called Bathsheba, whom he sees bathing on a rooftop. And to make matters worse, she soon becomes pregnant. David tries to cover his tracks and attempts to persuade her husband, Uriah, to sleep with his wife. When this fails, David quietly arranges him to be sent to the front lines, where he is killed in battle. This outrageous act angers God, who sends the prophet Nathan to announce his judgment. The prophet tells David a parable where he compares him to a rich man stealing a poor man's only lamb. Nathan declares that violence will plague David's house. Soon after, Bathsheba bears a child, but he dies in infancy. Many years passed, and after a failed uprising by David's son, Absalom, stability eventually returns to David's kingdom. Despite their earlier troubles, David marries Bathsheba, and they soon have a son, whom they name Solomon. David arranges him to be his successor. The figure of King David is a contradiction, a reminder that even the greatest figures in the Bible are not without their faults. The first book of Kings. David's son, King Solomon, was granted the gift of wisdom by God, and in this book he puts it to good use. In one story, he resolves a conflict between two women. Both claimed to be the mother of the same child, but neither was willing to give it up. Solomon offers a simple solution. Why not divide the child in half? That way, both mothers would get equal shares. Horrified at this thought, the first woman immediately renounces her claim, saying she would rather give up the child than to see it come to harm. In doing so, she proves herself to be the true mother. Later on, Solomon orders the construction of a grand temple in Jerusalem, which is to house the Ark of the Covenant. News of this grand monument travels far and wide, and even attracts the queen from the land of Sheba to witness its splendor. While Solomon brought fame and fortune to the nation, he too had his vices. Over the course of his rule, he amassed a total of 700 wives and 300 concubines. But that's not the problem here. Instead, the Bible tells us that these women were often from foreign nations and brought with them the worship of other gods, breaking the first law of the Ten Commandments. Upon Solomon's death, his kingdom soon splits between two territories, a northern kingdom, which keeps the name Israel, and a southern kingdom, which is called Judah. And from this point, things start to go horribly wrong. In the following years, the northern kingdom starts adopting pagan gods. One of the worst cases comes with King Ahab and his queen, Jezebel, who institute the worship of the weather god Baal. During this difficult time, God appoints a prophet called Elijah to restore the faith of Israel. In one famous scene, Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, asking their God to cool down fire from above. Taking the challenge, Baal's prophets create a large altar but fail to light the sacrifice. In response, Elijah douses his own altar with water and then prays. Suddenly, a great fire falls from heaven and consumes the offering. The second book of Kings. After his adventures as a prophet, Elijah is carried into heaven by a great whirlwind with chariots of fire. But before he left, he appointed a successor, Elisha, to try to restore the faith of Israel. While Elisha did many good deeds, there's one passage that has always stood out to me as being rather strange. As he was walking along the road, some boys came out of the town and jeered at him. "Get out of here, Baldy," they said. "Get out of here, Baldy." He turned around, looked at them, and called down a curse on them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 bears came out the woods and mauled 42 of the boys. Even now, I'm trying to figure out exactly what the message is, but I think it's something like, don't make fun of hair loss. The second book of Kings continues the story of the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and how things go from bad to worse, especially as powerful empires begin to stir in nearby lands. So far in this video, I've mentioned briefly the other people who lived in the region, but let me introduce you to some of them who play an important role in this story, starting with the Assyrian Empire. From the 9th century BC onwards, the nation of Assyria began to expand its borders. The empire began to threaten neighboring states, including the petty kingdoms of Israel and Judah. These Assyrian raids are frequently mentioned in the Bible, but curiously outside the Bible as well, like the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, which shows the Assyrian king standing triumphantly over conquered nations. One of them is believed to be King Jehu of Israel, who is groveling at the feet of his new master. It's one of the only contemporary depictions of a biblical king in existence. In 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel is conquered by the Assyrians. The southern kingdom of Judah just manages to survive by becoming a vassal state. During this difficult period, some Jewish kings attempt to renew the nation's faith in God, but it appeared that he was no longer on their side. Despite these challenges, Judah continued to hold on, just in time for an even greater threat to emerge. To the south of the Assyrian capital, Nineveh, lay the ancient city of Babylon. Located between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, it had long been a great city of culture and innovation. But under King Nabopolassar, it soon emerged as a fearsome military power, taking advantage of instability to the north. The Babylonian armies and their allies overthrew the Assyrians and ascended as the great power in the region. Under his successor, King Nebuchadnezzar II, the Babylonians began to march to Jerusalem. In 587 BC, the holy city was completely destroyed, and the sacred temple was burned to the ground. As was customary for conquered lands, the people were enslaved and taken to Babylon as exiles, and so begins one of the darkest periods in the Bible's history. The first and second books of Chronicles. The destruction of Jerusalem and the exile in Babylon triggered a profound religious crisis among the people. The loss of Jerusalem and its temple was tantamount to the defeat of God himself. We'll return to the devastation of the exile in the following books, but first, the curious case of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. You see, these two books are actually a recap of the entire story so far, especially on the reign of King David and his successors. As they largely summarize the events we've just explored, I shan't go over them again here, but what Chronicles do reveal is something about the history of how the Bible first emerged. During the exile in Babylon, Jewish scribes began to collect various hymns and folk stories and compile them into larger writings, stories that spoke about God and his relationship with his people. It is in this context that the very first biblical texts began to emerge, and arguably laying the foundations of Judaism as we know it today. Although the people were no longer tied to their land, these ancient stories brought the people together, helping the nation of Judah, or Jews, make sense of their history. Although the Book of Chronicles retells much of the story we've seen so far, it does feature a new detail. In 539 BC, decades after the exile began, the Babylonians were themselves conquered by the Persian king Cyrus the Great. In a surprising act of tolerance, Cyrus decreed that the Jewish people could return to their homeland and rebuild Jerusalem and their sacred temple. After years in exile, the Jewish people began to return home. The wait was finally over. The Book of Ezra. Although the return from captivity was an exciting time, it was also filled with uncertainty. On many people's minds was how to rebuild their broken lives and how to avoid the same mistakes as the past. And that's where the story of Ezra comes in, a Jewish scribe working at the Persian court who was sent to help instruct the people. But there was a problem. After many years of exile, the Jewish people were no longer living according to their ancient laws, and so Ezra sought to renew their faith. During this time, a second temple is built, one that was far greater than the first. This change in fortune was made possible by the generosity of the Persian kings. In fact, many biblical texts portray King Cyrus as working on behalf of God. Curiously, similar ideas appear in ancient artifacts from the time, like the so-called Cyrus cylinder, a small clay tablet written in the Akkadian language. It describes how Cyrus was chosen by the god Marduk to restore temples across the land and allow displaced peoples to return home. Although it doesn't mention the Jews specifically, it seems to align neatly with the biblical account. The Book of Nehemiah. Like the Book of Ezra, Nehemiah focuses on the rebuilding after the exile, specifically the crumbling city walls of Jerusalem. Working as the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, Nehemiah is sent to oversee the reconstruction of the city, and despite opposition from various groups, the walls are eventually rebuilt. Nehemiah then works to restore order among the Jewish people. It's a very brief story, but one that marks a turning point after the turmoil of the exile, as the Jewish community begins to re-establish itself in the holy city of Jerusalem. The Book of Esther. The final book in the histories is the Book of Esther, and this one is rather fun. It takes place in Persia during the reign of the semi-fictional king Ahasuerus, who is searching for a new wife. So he does what rulers tend to do and hosts a beauty pageant across his empire. The winner is a young Jewish woman named Esther, who is chosen to become the Queen of Persia. Now living at the royal court, Esther's cousin Mordecai discovers a secret plot by one of the king's officials, Haman, who is planning to destroy the Jewish people. Mordecai warns Esther of this treachery, and Esther passes the information on to her husband. Eventually, King Ahasuerus executes Haman, along with his 10 sons and the many supporters of this dastardly plan. The Book of Esther celebrates the origin of the festival of Purim, which commemorates survival and resilience. Another unusual feature of this book is that it's the only one where God's name is never directly mentioned. Perhaps this is intentional, hinting that God is working behind the scenes. The Book of Job. The next series of books step away from the history of Israel to explore life's big questions, like the Book of Job, which tackles one of the biggest problems of them all. Why do bad things happen to good people? Well, it's complicated. Meet Job. He is one of the Bible's most righteous people and is even described as, quote, blameless and upright. He prays on time, follows all the commandments, and even performs sacrifices on behalf of his family. What's more, he's fabulously wealthy and is respected by everyone. Job pretty much has it all, but his good fortunes are about to change. Up in heaven, God proudly presents Job as the perfect example of a human being. But that's when a mysterious figure known as the Satan enters the scene. The Satan is skeptical and suggests that Job is only loyal to God because he lives a blessed life. If God were to take away everything, then Job would reveal his true colours and curse God to his face. God pauses for a moment and then agrees to a little wager. He allows Satan to destroy Job's life and everything he owns. First his wealth, then his children, and finally his health. Job is left destitute and sits in an ash heap outside the village, itching his painful boils with shards of pottery. Yet, even despite this, he refuses to curse God. At that moment, 3 friends come to visit Job. Initially, they try to comfort him, but soon they begin to grow suspicious. You see, they have studied all the sacred texts and know that God always acts fairly. So they start to suspect that Job must have done something wrong to deserve this suffering. Job protests his innocence. He has done nothing wrong to deserve this fate, which, incidentally, is true. We already know that Job is totally innocent. The friends, however, don't buy it, and soon begin to invent reasons why he is being punished by God. Job grows frustrated and begins to argue that God has treated him unfairly. Suddenly, a great whirlwind appears, and an angry voice speaks from within. It is God, and he has a message for Job. God shows Job the vastness and complexity of the universe, from the inner workings of the cosmos to the many animals that inhabit it. By comparison, Job is nothing. God proves this through 2 enormous creatures, the Behemoth and Leviathan, showcasing their immense size and strength and Job's weakness in comparison. God returns Job to earth, and Job quickly apologizes to God, acknowledging the errors in his ways. Then God does something rather curious. He restores Job's fortune. All his livestock is returned and doubled, and he is even given an entirely new family. And with that, the story ends. If you find yourself scratching your head at this story, you're not alone. The book does not give a simple answer as to why bad things happen to good people. The closest we get is, hey look, a Leviathan. But maybe the lack of answers is the point. Perhaps the ways of God are simply beyond human understanding. The Book of Job has a reputation for being one of the Bible's most unfair stories. After all, Job is little more than a guinea pig in a cruel cosmic experiment. It's one of the most interesting books of the Bible, and if you want to learn more, do check out my deep dive on this very book. The Book of Psalms. I heard there was a secret chord that David played and it pleased the Lord. The Book of Psalms is a collection of 150 ancient hymns. Although they were traditionally viewed as being written by King David, many of them are likely much older. Almost all these songs describe God and his various attributes, from praising his creation to celebrating his mercy. The original melodies of these psalms have mostly been lost, but they may have been performed by an individual singer, accompanied by a lyre. All that remains now are these immortal lyrics. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths, for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. The Book of Proverbs. Where the Book of Psalms is a collection of songs, the Book of Proverbs is a collection of sayings. Many of them are traditionally attributed to King Solomon, who, if you remember, was known for his wisdom. The entire book is like a field guide on how to live well, exploring the virtues of wisdom to the pitfalls of foolishness. Some of the most well-known ones are rather straightforward, but others are a little more unusual. As a dog returns to its vomit, so fools repeat their folly. Some even seem to contradict each other. Do not answer a fool according to his foolishness, or you will be just like him. Answer a fool according to his foolishness, or he will be wise in his own eyes. In any case, the basic idea underlying the book is that the world follows principles woven into the cosmos. If people act wisely and live well, things will generally work out for the best. It's a comforting idea, but one that is challenged in this next book. The Book of Ecclesiastes. Of all the books in the Bible, this one is perhaps the most bleak or uplifting, depending on your perspective. The Book of Ecclesiastes is a collection of meditations by a mysterious figure simply called the Teacher, a man who has lived a long life and has seen everything under the sun. After all his years of searching, the Teacher has finally found the meaning of life. Meaningless, meaningless, says the Teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. It's quite the announcement. The word here for meaningless, sometimes translated as vanity, is from the Hebrew word hevel, which means smoke or vapor. The Teacher compares much of what we do in life to grasping at smoke. No matter what we achieve, in a few generations, we will be all but forgotten. It's an unsettling thought, but the Teacher may be onto something. Perhaps human life really is nothing more than a single breath in an infinite, empty cosmos. The Teacher's distressing revelations are what we would now refer to as an existential crisis, and the Book of Ecclesiastes is perhaps one of the first recorded examples in world literature. Now, for some, this all might seem a little depressing, but it needn't be. You see, life's fleeting nature brings with it a gift. Freedom. The freedom to experience what the world has to offer. The freedom to define yourself within it. The freedom to enjoy life while it lasts. It's actually a conclusion that the Teacher himself arrives at after all his years of searching and being confused by the absurd realities of life. He imparts this final piece of wisdom. Go. Eat your food with gladness, and drink your wine with a joyful heart, for God has already approved what you do. Always be clothed in white, and always anoint your head with oil. Enjoy life with your wife, whom you love, all the days of this meaningless life that God has given you under the sun. According to the Teacher, people should follow a single commandment. We must eat, drink, and be merry, for existence is but a brief interval of consciousness in a vast and unknowing universe. The Song of Songs. The Song of Songs is a Hebrew idiom meaning the greatest song in the world, but this is just a tribute. Like all timeless pieces of music, the Song of Songs is based on love. It follows a pair of lovers likening the other person to the wondrous beauties of the natural world. But some of these descriptions can get a little out of hand. Your teeth are like a flock of sheep just shorn, coming up from the washing. Each has a twin, not one of them is alone. Now, there's one confusing thing about this book. Why does the Bible feature love poetry? Many have tried to answer this question. For early thinkers, the book is often seen as an allegory, Perhaps the soul's quest for God, or perhaps it's God's affection for his people, or maybe it's Jesus' love for the church. But while all these are possible, it may just be a simple love poem. After all, similar pieces of literature were common across the ancient Near East. In Egypt in particular, there are a number of poems that compare love to the wonders of the natural world. The Book of Isaiah. We now arrive at the final section of the Old Testament. The prophets, individuals that were chosen by God to reveal his message to the people. So let's begin with Isaiah, the first of the major prophets. The book of Isaiah is a massive collection of oracles, with 66 chapters in total. They contain warnings during key moments in Israel's history, from the fall of the northern kingdom all the way to the exile in Babylon. Now, perhaps you've already noticed the problem. These events were more than 130 years apart. So how could they all have been written by one individual? Well, for a long time now, scholars have questioned whether this book really does have one single author. The first part of this book are likely the original prophet's oracles from a man who lived at the time of the Assyrian invasion. In these first chapters, God tells Isaiah to warn the people, those who have turned away from him. For their sins, the nation will be punished by foreign powers. Despite this warning, there is hope. For Isaiah speaks of a future king from the line of David, one who will bring peace and justice. Now, this line is particularly popular for Christians, where it is often read at Christmas. But perhaps my favorite story from Isaiah is the moment he is chosen to be God's prophet. Isaiah has a vision in which he is inside the Jerusalem temple, and before him is the throne of God. All around him are seraphim. Of course, Isaiah is terrified and fears that his mouth is too unclean to preach the word of God. That's when one seraph flies towards him and places a hot coal between his lips to purify his speech. Despite Isaiah's warnings, during the time of the Babylonians, Jerusalem is destroyed, and it's here where another series of prophecies take place, known as Deutero-Isaiah. This part of the book often describes God as the universal king, the one true ruler of creation who plans to restore his chosen people and is even able to work through foreign kings like Cyrus the Great. This section also features a number of servant songs, poems that describe a figure who suffers on behalf of others, yet remains fully faithful to God. The final part of this book seems to take place years after the return to Jerusalem. Known as Trito-Isaiah, it is a series of hymns and prayers which give thanks to God who has restored his people. Although this book might have been written by different figures, a broader theme runs throughout, that God is in control of the arc of history. The Book of Jeremiah. On the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, you will find this painting of the prophet Jeremiah. It shows him with a hand over his mouth, seemingly lost in anguished meditation. It's a fitting image, for Jeremiah is often known as the weeping prophet. The Book of Jeremiah is a collection of his prophecies. Set during the eve of the Babylonian invasion, God calls Jeremiah to warn the people of Judah. Because they have turned away from God and worshipped other deities, their nation will soon be destroyed. Alongside these oracles of doom, the book of Jeremiah also contains some glimmers of hope. It predicts that even after the destruction, God will one day restore his people and will make a new covenant with them, after which the nation will finally be obedient to him. Despite his prophecies, the people fail to listen to Jeremiah. The prophet is mocked, beaten, and even thrown into a pit. Shortly afterwards, the Babylonian armies arrive. The Book of Lamentations. Often said to be written by Jeremiah, the Book of Lamentations is set in the ashes of the ruined Jerusalem. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who was once great among the nations. In carefully constructed poetry, these lamentations describe Jerusalem as a grieving widow, mourning the loss of her people. It's a rather gloomy book, But city laments like these were actually a rather common genre across the ancient world, like this one from ancient Sumer, written more than 1,000 years before this biblical text. Enlil blew an evil storm, and silence fell upon the city. Across ancient Near Eastern culture, if a god's city was destroyed, it was believed that either the god had abandoned it or had even perished with it altogether. The Book of Ezekiel. I've been looking forward to this one. You see, Ezekiel is perhaps the strangest book in the Old Testament. Set during the Jewish exile in Babylon, the Book of Ezekiel famously features a vision of God's throne. This time, it is surrounded by a group of mysterious beings, known only as the living creatures. Each of them has 4 wings and 4 faces, one of a human, an ox, a lion, and finally an eagle. Beside these bizarre creatures is a strange being known only as an Ophanim. It has the appearance of a wheel within a wheel, but with eyes all along the outer rims. Above these angelic figures floats a giant throne. Seated upon it is a glowing figure in the likeness of a man. This is one of the most bizarre passages in the entire Bible and is the focus of one of my most popular videos. To this day, people aren't exactly sure what these figures are or what they're supposed to represent. Some scholars compare these beings to early depictions of Yahweh, who on ancient coinage is sometimes shown seated upon a giant chariot featuring large cosmic wheels. Others believe that this vision is entirely symbolic and represents the omniscience and omnipotence of God. After this magnificent vision of God's throne, Ezekiel is commissioned to speak on his behalf. But in order to announce God's prophecies, Ezekiel must first eat a scroll, which contains God's precise wording. Despite the many sins of the people, God refuses to abandon them, and he demonstrates this with another strange vision. In it, Ezekiel sees a valley filled with dry human bones. Suddenly, the bones begin to reanimate and connect together. Soon, the bones grow flesh and return to life. Aside from being a terrifying image, this acts as a metaphor that the broken image of Israel will one day be restored. The final prophecy in the book of Ezekiel is also worth mentioning, mainly because it is very, very long. Over the course of several chapters, Ezekiel describes a vision of a new temple. He does so with extraordinary detail and even provides precise architectural measurements, down to the length of the walls and the dimensions of the various courts. Although a second temple was eventually rebuilt, curiously, the building that Ezekiel describes is entirely hypothetical. Some believe it refers to a building that is yet to be built. The Book of Daniel. The Book of Daniel is set during the time of the exile and follows a man called Daniel, a prophet, who helps interpret the dreams of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, the same ruler, if you recall, who laid siege to Jerusalem. In one dream, Nebuchadnezzar sees a giant statue made of different materials, from a head made of gold to feet made of iron and clay. Then, suddenly, a great stone falls from the sky and destroys the statue. Faced with this bizarre dream, Daniel suggests that each part of the statue represents a different, powerful kingdom in history, and that the stone refers to an eternal kingdom that is still yet to come. In another story, Nebuchadnezzar throws Daniel's companions into a fire for refusing to abandon their faith. Yet, miraculously, they survive unharmed. Afterwards, God punishes Nebuchadnezzar, making him go mad and causing him to wander around like an animal. One thing I like about the Book of Daniel is it contains the origin of a popular phrase, like the idiom, the writing on the wall, which describes the inevitability of a coming event. This phrase comes from the feast of Prince Belshazzar, where he and his guests drink from vessels stolen from the Jewish temple. Then, suddenly, a mysterious hand appears on the wall, interrupting the feast. It writes the words, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, words that foretell the fall of Babylon. Of all the stories in Daniel, By far the most famous is the one where the prophet is thrown into a den of hungry lions. To come to his rescue, God closes the mouths of the animals, and Daniel survives unharmed. The final part of the book of Daniel focuses on a series of prophecies, where, believe it or not, things get even stranger, like a series of visions featuring monsters rising out of the sea. These include a lion with eagle's wings, a bear raised on one side, a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads, and finally, a terrifying fourth beast with teeth made of iron. Then, finally, Daniel sees a figure who appears like a, quote, son of man, who will establish an everlasting dominion after these beasts. Like the book of Ezekiel, the book of Daniel is a really strange text, and certainly deserves a deep dive of its own. It's one of the earliest examples of apocalyptic literature, a genre of writing that became popular in the Second Temple period. It comes from the Greek word apocalypsis, meaning reveal, and often centers around strange and disturbing visions. Many of them concern the end of the world. This book is also an odd one out among the Old Testament. You see, parts of this book are written in Aramaic, a cousin of the Hebrew language, one that came to be spoken in the centuries before the time of Jesus. This suggests that the book of Daniel might have been written towards the end of the Old Testament period. We now arrive at the final books of the Old Testament, the 12 minor prophets. Now, because there are quite a few of them, and they're each relatively short, I've set myself a little challenge to keep each description to under a minute. Ready, set, go. The book of Hosea. Set in the northern kingdom of Israel, God calls on the prophet Hosea to pronounce judgment on those who worship other gods, but does so in a very unusual way. God tells Hosea to marry a woman called Gomer, who later proves to be unfaithful to him. This is all just to illustrate a point. Just like Hosea was cheated on, the nation of Israel has cheated on God. God then tells Hosea to take his wife back, even after she's been unfaithful, an act that represents how one day God will take Israel back as well. The book of Joel. A swarm of locusts devastates the land, leading to widespread famine. The prophet Joel interprets this as a sign of God's judgment, or possibly the symbol of an invading army. He calls on the people to repent and warns of a coming day of the Lord, which will be much, much worse. After the nation prays, God relents and promises to restore the land. The book of Amos. Perhaps the oldest prophetic book in the Bible, Amos tells the story of a shepherd from the countryside who is called to criticize the corruption of society, especially the rich, those who lie down on beds of ivory, while the poor break their backs. Because of the moral failure of the nation's leaders, Amos speaks of a disaster that is yet to come. The book of Obadiah. An extremely short book, Obadiah is a prophecy against the Edomites, a neighboring kingdom to the east of Israel, who are descended from Esau, the brother of Jacob. Because the Edomites did not help Jerusalem in its hour of need, God will wipe them from the face of the earth. The book of Jonah. God calls Jonah to be a prophet and speak out against the city of Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire. But instead, Jonah runs away and sails in the opposite direction. While he is on the boat, a great storm rages. Jonah is thrown overboard and is swallowed by a giant fish. In the belly of the beast, Jonah prays for forgiveness, and after 3 days is vomited back onto dry land. Jonah eventually goes to Nineveh and delivers a very short warning that the city may or may not be destroyed. Surprisingly, the people immediately repent, and God spares the city entirely. Then the book takes an amusing turn. Jonah becomes angry that his message actually worked. Ironically, he wanted their destruction, but God has spared them. God then raises a plant to shelter Jonah from the heat of the day. And then God kills it, much to Jonah's distress. But he does this to prove a point. If Jonah can care about a little plant, then God can care about an entire city of people and their livestock. The Book of Micah. As great empires threatened the people of Israel, the leaders of the nation were more interested in their luxury than actually dealing with the problems facing their society. The prophet Micah warns against this moral rot, declaring that judgment will one day come because of their corruption, even if it means the destruction of Jerusalem. Despite these warnings, there is hope for change. For according to Micah, a ruler will arise from Bethlehem who will lead the people into a better future, and they will live by a single command: do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. In this new world, weapons will be turned into farming tools, and humanity will live as one. The Book of Nahum. This book is a prophecy against Assyria, the powerful state that oppressed Israel. Because Assyria has been violent and oppressive, the prophet Nahum announces that God is going to destroy their capital, Nineveh. What follows is a graphic description of the city's destruction. Nahum even gloats over the suffering the people of Nineveh endure and describes how bodies will pile up in the streets of the city. Because of its violent and often upsetting language, the Book of Nahum is often criticized as being one of the Old Testament's cruelest books. The Book of Habakkuk. As we've seen so far, the ancient kingdom of Israel was threatened by foreign powers on many occasions. And so, the prophet Habakkuk asks a simple question: why doesn't God just intervene? God responds to the prophet that he has a plan, and is actually using the enemy's armies to carry out his judgment on the kingdom of Judah, who have turned away from him. Upon hearing this, Habakkuk is disturbed. Why would God do such a thing? God tells Habakkuk that while evil empires like Babylon might triumph for a while, its sins will ultimately lead to its downfall. Only then will justice be restored. The book ends with Habakkuk choosing to trust God, even in the face of suffering. The Book of Zephaniah. The Book of Zephaniah is a scathing critique of idol worship and a warning that a great judgment, called the Day of the Lord, is on its way. The Day of the Lord will be a time of great chaos and destruction, especially for those who have been unfaithful to God. But afterwards, a faithful remnant will survive the destruction, and a better world will emerge from the ashes of the old one. The Book of Haggai. This obscure story is set after the Babylonian exile, when the people have returned to Jerusalem. But while the citizens are busy rebuilding their homes, the temple lies unfinished. The prophet Haggai is sent to encourage them to work on the temple first, promising that if they do, God's blessing will return to the city. Eventually, the people are convinced and get to work completing the temple. The Book of Zechariah. This book contains a series of apocalyptic visions. There are 8 of them in total, like a golden lampstand, a flying scroll, and even a woman being carried away in a basket. These strange visions are believed to symbolize the final restoration of Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple, somehow at least. The book also describes a scene from the future and mentions the coming of a Messiah who will ride on the back of a humble donkey. This king will defeat evil once and for all. The Book of Malachi. The final book in the Old Testament is set after the return from the exile, where the prophet Malachi notices that the people have become careless with their faith. Even the priests are showing signs of corruption once more. Malachi challenges the people to renew their covenant with God and not to repeat the same mistakes as the past. The book ends with a promise that a messenger will come to prepare the way before the day of the Lord finally arrives. And there we have it, the entirety of the Old Testament books. From Genesis to Malachi, it tells the stories of the Jewish people and their covenants with God. But as with all relationships, things are never quite perfect. If I'm to summarize this vast collection into a single sentence, it's this: forsake around and find out. You see, a central theme throughout the Old Testament is what happens when you disobey God and his sacred laws. In particular, the first commandment. Again and again, the people learn this lesson, often the hard way. What I find especially fascinating about the Old Testament is that it's full of brilliant but flawed characters, and the stories about them are unafraid to show their vulnerabilities and how they struggled with their faith. I also find the wisdom books particularly interesting, especially as they contain profound observations on the nature of the universe and our place within it. To me, these writings are some of the finest works of ancient philosophy penned in any language. Now, for Jewish people, these books make up the entirety of their sacred scripture, and they are known as the Tanakh. But for Christians, the Bible story doesn't quite end here. You see, in the centuries to come, there was a person who many believe fulfilled these ancient Jewish prophecies, and the writings about him are the focus of these next books. The New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew. By the time of the 1st century AD, a great deal has changed for the Jewish people. They are now living under the rule of a new empire, the Romans, and are governed by local client kings, or directly by Roman officials. They were also deeply unpopular, especially as they demanded harsh taxation from their subjects. In response, the Jewish people would often rise up against their overlords, holding to the promise that God would one day save them. Many of these hopes centered on the Messiah, a descendant of King David, whom the ancient prophets said would restore Israel and be crowned King of the Jews. Amid this troubled context, accounts soon began to emerge of a preacher called Jesus of Nazareth, a man who gained a large popular following and was even said to fulfill these ancient prophecies. The Gospel of Matthew is one of the 4 accounts of the life of Jesus. They each tell a different version of the same story, and Matthew's Gospel aims to show that Jesus is the long-awaited Jewish Messiah, as foretold by the ancient scriptures. The story begins with Jesus' birth, or nativity, where a young woman called Mary discovers she has become pregnant through mysterious circumstances. Her husband, Joseph, suspects that she has been unfaithful and secretly plans to divorce her. But in a dream, Joseph is visited by an angel who tells him that the child has been born of the Holy Spirit. What's more, the boy is to be called Yeshua, or Jesus, a name which translates to God saves. The child is brought to term in the ancient city of Bethlehem, and the family are soon visited by Magi, bearing gifts fit for a king. But the peace is soon disturbed, for King Herod hears about this child, the so-called King of the Jews. Fearing that the boy would one day usurp his throne, Herod orders a massacre of infant boys in the city. Fearing their lives, the family flees to Egypt for safety. Many years passed, and we are soon introduced to a man called John the Baptist, who lived in the wilderness by the River Jordan. Despite his shaggy appearance, people travelled far and wide to be baptized by John. One of them is Jesus, now fully grown, who also asks to be baptized. As soon as the waters touch his head, the heavens open, and the Spirit of God descends like a dove. Then a voice from heaven announces, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." Shortly after, Jesus heads into the desert, where he fasts for 40 days and 40 nights. But while he is there, he is tempted by the devil, who tries to persuade him to use his powers for personal gain. Jesus resists each time and displays his knowledge of the ancient teachings. Sometime later, Jesus is walking by the Sea of Galilee and calls on 2 fishermen, Simon and Andrew, to join his party. They accept and become his first disciples. Afterwards, Jesus travels around performing miracles, healing the sick, and driving out demons. Over time, large crowds begin to follow him and want to hear Jesus preach. What follows is the famous Sermon on the Mount. the first of 5 major discourses in this Gospel. It begins with a series of blessings, known as the Beatitudes, in which Jesus declares that a great reversal is about to take place. In this so-called kingdom of God, those who are currently dispossessed and powerless will inherit the earth. It soon becomes clear among Jesus' disciples that this person may be more than just an ordinary man, especially when Jesus takes them up a high mountain, where he is transfigured and shines with a radiant white light. Alongside him are the ancient prophets, Moses and Elijah. After traveling through the Judean countryside some more, Jesus and his disciples finally arrive at Jerusalem. Entering the city on the back of a donkey, the people greet him by throwing down their cloaks and laying branches before his path. But not everyone was so fond of Jesus, especially the religious authorities like the Pharisees and Sadducees. This comes to a head when Jesus violently cleanses the Jerusalem temple and drives out the moneylenders and merchants operating in God's sacred house. Then Jesus launches a tirade against the religious authorities, including his famous 7 woes, where he denounces their hypocrisy and spiritual blindness. Later, while seated on the Mount of Olives outside the city, Jesus' disciples ask him what signs will mark the end of the age. Jesus reveals a troubling vision. It will be a time of great tribulation. Nations will be at war. Natural disasters will plague humanity, and false prophets will spread deceit. But shortly after, a large trumpet will sound, and the Son of Man will return in glory. But when this will happen remains uncertain. Days pass, and Jesus and his disciples prepare for Passover, celebrating the time when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. But while others are making preparations, one of the 12, Judas Iscariot, sneaks off to the chief priests and agrees to hand Jesus over for 30 pieces of silver. Later, during the Passover supper, Jesus shares bread and wine with the disciples and predicts that one of them will betray him. That night, Jesus and his disciples travel to the Garden of Gethsemane, but they are soon ambushed by a group of guards who arrest Jesus. He is taken away to be tried before the religious council, where they accuse him of blasphemy. Meanwhile, the disciple Peter denies knowing Jesus 3 times, an act that is signaled by the crowing of a rooster. Although Jesus has been condemned under Jewish law, the authority to carry out the death penalty lies with the Roman state, and so Jesus is taken to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Despite believing Jesus to be innocent, Pilate washes his hands of the responsibility and allows him to die the death that the crowd is chanting for, crucifixion. Jesus is then taken away, whipped and mocked by the soldiers, who place a crown of thorns on his head. Jesus is forced to carry his cross to a place called Golgotha, meaning the place of the skull, where he is crucified alongside 2 rebels. After several hours of agonizing pain, a sudden darkness falls over the land. Then Jesus cries out in his native language, Aramaic, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Shortly after, Jesus cries out again and gives up his spirit. The moment this happens, a powerful earthquake shakes the land, and the sacred curtain of the temple is ripped in 2. Then, those who witness these events are filled with fear, recognizing Jesus as the Son of God. Afterwards, Jesus' lifeless body is taken down from the cross, wrapped in clean linen, and placed in a tomb to be buried. 3 days later, a follower of Jesus Christ, Mary Magdalene, decides to visit the tomb, but is shocked when an angel suddenly descends from heaven and rolls away the stone. Mary hurries to tell the disciples, and, on the way, encounters a man she recognizes. It is Jesus, and he is alive. After reuniting with the disciples, Jesus leads them to a mountain and commissions them to make disciples of every nation, promising his followers, quote, I am with you to the very end of the age. The Gospel of Matthew is often considered to be one of the most comprehensive retellings of the life of Jesus, especially as it includes some of the most comprehensive accounts of his teachings. What makes Matthew so distinctive is its frequent use of quotations from the Jewish scriptures. Throughout the Gospel, the author shows how the events in Jesus' life were foretold by the prophets in the ancient days of Israel. At the same time, the Gospel strongly criticizes the religious leaders of the day, those who doubted that Jesus was the Messiah. These details suggest that the Gospel of Matthew likely emerged when the early Christian community was beginning to separate from Judaism. The Gospel of Matthew was likely written around 80 to 90 AD, so about a generation or two after Jesus' life. Curiously, this Gospel draws much of its material from another text, one that's believed to be the earliest account of the life of Jesus, and it's here we turn to next. The Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is the shortest of the four Gospels, and as a result has often been a little overlooked. But not in recent years. You see, most biblical scholars believe that Mark might be the oldest and may reflect the earliest stories told about Jesus. If you were to open a copy of Mark's Gospel, you may notice something different from the others. You see, it's very short and compact, and it seems that the writer's favourite word is immediately, which is repeated throughout the book. Jesus immediately did this, and immediately did that. It's as if the author was in a hurry to write everything down. What's more, the language of this Gospel is also a little less refined than the others, and often leaves in Aramaic words untranslated. If you recall, Aramaic would have been the language that Jesus originally spoke. While some say that Mark's Gospel is a little unpolished, this actually might point to its authenticity and was possibly written around 65 to 70 AD. But leaving questions of who wrote what and when to one side, Mark's Gospel is unique for a whole host of other reasons too. Many of these stories depict Jesus as a miracle worker, someone who had the power to heal the sick and drive out demons. Perhaps the most famous story is when Jesus approaches an afflicted man and asks the demon inside him to identify himself. Speaking through the man, the demon responds, "Legion, for we are many." Jesus casts the legion of demons into a herd of pigs, who rush off into a nearby lake. Interestingly, whenever Jesus performs acts like these, he's often very secretive about it. Throughout Mark's Gospel, he constantly tells his disciples not to tell anyone about what they have seen, as if cautious about revealing his true identity. Much of Mark's Gospel contains the same story beats we've seen already, but there are a couple of unique additions if you know where to look. Like the story of the naked fugitive, a very brief but very strange inclusion in the Bible. During Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, an onlooker wearing nothing but a loosely fitting cloth enters the scene. When the angry guards try to seize him, the cloth slips and the man flees into the night totally naked. This passage has no relevance to the story at hand, so many wonder why it was even included. Mark's Gospel ends like the others, with the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. That said though, it does end rather abruptly, with the scene of the empty tomb and the women running away in fear. Later manuscripts of Mark seem to have added an additional conclusion, featuring Jesus reunited with the disciples. As I mentioned before, the Gospel of Mark is widely assumed to be the earliest of the four Gospels, largely due to the style of its writing. Its collection of parables, teachings, and miracles were likely gathered from early oral accounts and written down into one book around 65 to 70 AD. In fact, much of its material reappears in Matthew's Gospel, but the same is true for this next Gospel. The Gospel of Luke. This Gospel is often seen to be the most compassionate of the four, as it's filled with stories highlighting the importance of generosity and caring for those in need. The Gospel of Luke includes a note from its author, and begins with a short preface addressed to a man called Theophilus. The author, presumably Luke himself, explains that he has investigated the early sources and has put together this orderly account to help clear things up. And this is the result. The Gospel of Luke starts with the angel Gabriel visiting Mary to announce her surprise pregnancy, and so Mary and her husband Joseph travel to Bethlehem, where she gives birth to Jesus. This version of the Nativity story also features a group of shepherds witnessing a cosmic angelic encounter. Be not afraid, I bring good news that will cause great joy for all people. After the Christmas story, the Gospel includes a short passage about Jesus' childhood, where the boy Jesus visits the temple and outsmarts the teachers. This story is the only account we have of the childhood of Jesus. Well, the only canonical account, at least. According to the apocryphal Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the child Jesus goes on a mild killing spree, but that's a story for another video. When he grows up, Jesus travels across the land, calling his first disciples and performing his first miracles. But what the Gospel of Luke is most known for are its many parables, stories with hidden meanings. While parables appear in the other books, Luke is often seen to have the most, several of which are unique to this Gospel, like the parable of the Good Samaritan, which tells the story of a man who was attacked by thieves and left for dead at the side of the road. Hours later, a priest finds him but decides to walk on by. So too does a Levite. But then, hours later, a Samaritan stops by and takes pity on the man. Despite being an outsider, the Samaritan cares for him and brings the man to a local inn, where he pays the innkeeper to look after him. The story ends with a question. Which of these three passers-by do you think acted as a neighbor? With parables like these, Luke presents Jesus as a man who advocated compassion and preached for others to do the same. Many of his stories show a keen interest in the dignity of all people, but especially those who are poor and marginalized. The author of Luke was also interested in salvation, but not just for the Jewish people, instead for everyone. Because of this, many scholars believe that this gospel was written to non-Jews, those who had converted to Christianity. So that's Luke, the Gospel of Compassion. Now, before we move on to this author's second volume, The Acts of the Apostles, there is still one gospel to go, one that is believed to be the most mystical of them all. The Gospel of John. This Gospel begins with one of the most famous lines in the entire Bible. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. What follows is a short prologue that retells the creation story, but this time reveals that Jesus was present from the very beginning. It describes Jesus as the Logos, or Word of God, and then explains how the Word became flesh and dwelt among humanity. In other words, the Gospel presents Jesus as not just a preacher or prophet, but actually as God incarnate. The Gospel of John is often seen to be the most theological of the four Gospels, and explores the various signs that seem to prove Jesus' divine status. Often, these take the form of miracles, from turning water into wine to raising Lazarus back from the dead. This text is also a bit of an odd one out among the four Gospels, where the other Gospels seem to share similar material. The Gospel of John appears to have developed from a distinctive theological tradition. As a result, much of the material here is totally unique. Unlike the other Gospels, John contains almost no parables. Instead, it features several extended discourses, where Jesus uses highly metaphorical language to explain his true identity. One of the most distinctive features are the many I am sayings, where Jesus describes himself as the bread of life, the light of the world, the true vine, and the good shepherd. These statements are meant to show readers that Jesus is the path to salvation. The Gospel of John also has plenty of story too, especially when it comes to Jesus' betrayal and crucifixion. Curiously, however, the Gospel gives an impression that Jesus already knows the fate that awaits him, and that his betrayal by Judas Iscariot is all part of a wider cosmic plan. This seems to come to fruition during the final moments of the crucifixion, where Jesus simply declares, "It is finished." At this point, I'm sure you know what happens next. Jesus returns from the dead 3 days after his burial, but this time, one of the disciples, Thomas, is not quite convinced by these rumors and wants to touch the wounds of the crucifixion for himself. The Gospel of John is a fascinating text and contains some of the central ideas of Christian theology. Judging by its contents, it appears that early Christians were increasingly interested in understanding not just what Jesus did, but who he actually was. It may not surprise you to learn that John's Gospel is generally considered to be the latest of the four, and was possibly written between 90 to 100 AD. And there we have it, the four Gospels. These four accounts are the most important biographies of Jesus. Stories of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus would go on to inspire a movement that spread rapidly across the Mediterranean, a movement that would lay the foundations of Christianity. And that is the focus of these next books. The Acts of the Apostles. The remaining books in the New Testament explored the events after the life of Jesus. The Acts of the Apostles is a book in its own category. Written by the same author as the Gospel of Luke, the story focuses on how the apostles spread the teachings of Jesus and established the very first Christian communities around the Mediterranean. Their efforts were mainly led by Peter, who was Jesus' closest disciple. One of the most well-known parts in this book is the story of Pentecost. As the apostles are preaching, the Holy Spirit suddenly comes over them. At that moment, tongues of fire appear above each of their heads, and they all begin to talk in different languages. People travel from far and wide to hear them speak, and many convert to the new faith. But not everybody was so enthusiastic, especially the local authorities that had crucified Jesus. In fact, they now begin to persecute Jesus' followers and accuse a man called Stephen of blasphemy, stoning him to death. But one of the fiercest opponents of the early church was a man called Saul of Tarsus, who often took part in persecutions against these so-called Christians. But all that was about to change. You see, one day, Saul was traveling to the city of Damascus when a sudden bright light knocked him off his horse. Then came the voice of Jesus and called on Saul to change his ways. Soon, Saul converts and pledges his life to following Jesus. From this point on, he is often referred to by his Roman name, Paul, and, as we shall see, he is to become one of early Christianity's most important leaders. The rest of Acts follows the early missions of the key figures in early Christianity, particularly Peter, but later Paul as well. Both travel across the eastern Mediterranean and set up early Christian communities wherever they went. Of course, the persecutions still continued, and the apostles once again faced trouble with the authorities. Peter is imprisoned, but later freed by an angel, and Paul is taken to Rome to be tried as a Roman citizen. While in the city, he is placed under house arrest for 2 years, and it is there, rather abruptly, that the story of this book comes to an end. The Acts of the Apostles shows how this early movement developed and organized, and how they were guided by influential figures in the early church. Few, of course, were more influential than the Apostle Paul, whose letters to the early Christian churches make up the next section of the New Testament. The Epistle to the Romans. In the years following the life of Jesus, Christianity spread beyond the borders of its ancestral homeland and into the towns and cities across the Mediterranean. To stay connected over vast distances, letter writing became the key means of communication. Many of them survive today, preserved in the Bible's New Testament. In total, there are 21 of these letters, or epistles, 13 of which are traditionally attributed to the Apostle Paul. Together, they help explain what Christianity is and how followers of Jesus are supposed to live. So let's start with what is considered to be the most important letter of them all. Written between 55 to 57 AD, Paul's letter to the church in Rome is often seen as the clearest expression of early Christian belief. Paul gets straight into business. What does it mean to follow Jesus? In the years gone by, God's people observed the Jewish law and tried to live faithfully according to its rituals and rules. But Paul suggests that that alone does not make a person righteous. After all, even Israel's religious leaders were not exempt from human weakness and failure. Instead, Paul argues that God's righteousness has now been revealed through Jesus, and that people are now declared righteous by God through their faith in him, an idea which is known as justification. Paul goes on to explain how Jesus addresses a particular problem that has plagued humanity, and that's sin. Ever since Adam first disobeyed God in Eden, human sin has created a gulf between human beings and their creator. And while the Jewish law of the Old Testament may have seemed like the way to restore the relationship with God, it ultimately revealed humanity's shortcomings more than anything else. Paul proclaims that faith in Jesus represents the true path to salvation and is the culmination of God's plan for humanity. What's more, this salvation is open to everyone and no longer just the people of Israel. The first epistle to the Corinthians. Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth seems to have been written under rather awkward circumstances. You see, this church was troubled by reports of immorality and internal division, and so Paul wrote this letter to address these issues, from the dangers of sexual immorality to whether or not to eat food sacrificed to idols. A famous part of this letter is a discourse on the nature of love, and how it is the supreme Christian virtue. Today, this passage in particular is one of the most quoted sections of the New Testament. Toward the end of the letter, Paul reminds the Corinthians of the importance of the resurrection and how it is an essential part of Christian belief, just in case anyone was doubting that. Finally, he concludes the letter with practical matters and expresses his hope that these words will finally bring an end to the troubling reports coming from the church in Corinth. The second epistle to the Corinthians. By the time of this letter, it appears that the church in Corinth had once again fallen into trouble. This time, however, Paul was at the center of it. Judging by the contents of this letter, we can piece together a few details. It appears that a group of rival teachers had arrived in the city and had begun to challenge Paul's authority, sowing seeds of doubt and division from within the community. This tension was likely made worse by a previous visit in which Paul had left on rather difficult terms with the Corinthians, leaving their relationship rather strained. In his second letter, Paul attempts to reconcile with them as a way to restore the damaged relationship between himself and the church. Paul explores the importance of forgiveness as a way to restore the damaged relationship between himself and the church. At the same time, however, Paul defends his own leadership and warns the church not to be misled by these rival teachers, no matter how confident they might appear. Instead, he argues that true Christian leadership is marked by humility and faithfulness. The Epistle to the Galatians. This letter focuses on resolving a dispute that had arisen within the churches of Galatia, a region in modern-day Turkey. Although the congregation had accepted the teachings of Jesus, they were less clear on whether to follow the Jewish law as well. Paul argues that following the law implies that faith in Christ is not enough. Instead, he insists that people are justified by faith, not by works of the law. The letter shows Christianity at a time when it was still defining itself in relation to Judaism. Was this a Jewish movement or something else entirely? Paul seems to present the faith as something rather new that requires a very new way of thinking, a faith that is open to everyone and not just those who follow the Jewish law. The Epistle to the Ephesians. Ephesus was one of the most important centers of the Roman Empire, as well as early Christianity, and Paul's letter to the people in this city is often seen as one of his most important writings, although there is some debate over how much of this letter Paul actually wrote. Regardless, a key theme of this letter is that all humanity is united under Jesus, and that the distinction between Jews and non-Jews no longer matters. Finally, the letter ends with an instruction to, quote, put on the full armor of God, and for followers to protect themselves against the many schemes of the devil. The Epistle to the Philippians. The letter to the church at Philippi was written during a difficult time in Paul's life. From the very opening of the letter, it appears that Paul is writing from prison and may have even been facing execution. Despite this, he remains hopeful and unafraid of death, expressing his confidence in Jesus. In these circumstances, Paul discusses the importance of being joyful in the face of suffering. He encourages the church in Philippi to remain united, whatever the future may bring. The Epistle to the Colossians. This letter appears to have been written in response to a crisis facing this church. Members of the congregation were being influenced by rival philosophies and teachings, and some were at risk of being misled. In the letter, Paul outlines Christian belief once more and emphasizes the supremacy of Christ over all creation. He teaches them that everything was created through him, and so, therefore, nothing is greater than him. As a result, believers ought not to be persuaded by fine-sounding arguments. Christ alone is sufficient. The first epistle to the Thessalonians. Paul's first letter to the church in Thessalonica begins with praise. He is pleased to hear encouraging reports that the community he founded is flourishing. After this brief introduction, he addresses several issues the believers are facing, one of which is how Christians should respond when a member of the community dies. Paul reassures them that while they should grieve, they should also remain hopeful, because when Jesus returns at the second coming, all those who believe in him shall be raised from the dead. Until that day, Paul encourages them to take comfort and expresses his excitement to visit them once again. Incidentally, this letter is believed to be the oldest surviving text written by Paul. Dated to around 49 to 51 AD, it likely predates the Gospels. It is widely considered to be one of the earliest surviving Christian texts. The second epistle to the Thessalonians. This letter explores what will happen during the day of the Lord, as well as the second coming of Christ. According to this letter, Jesus will return in blazing fire, surrounded by his most powerful angels, and with him bringing harsh judgment on those who do not obey God. The letter also warns about a strange figure known as the man of lawlessness, someone who works on behalf of Satan and will attempt to persuade people to rebel against God through false teachings. But before these events can take place, Christians are urged to remain watchful, avoid being misled, and hold firmly to the teachings. The first epistle to Timothy. The following letters focus on the organization and behavior of the Christian community. These include instructions about the roles of men and women, how to care for the elderly, and the qualifications required for church leaders. The letter also warns about false teachers, as well as those who corrupt others for financial gain. He expresses this through a famous line, quote, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil." The second epistle to Timothy. Written near the end of his life, Paul discusses the importance of faithfulness and urges believers to persevere in their faith. However, he also recognizes that the church is beginning to face new challenges. He even mentions two specific false teachers, Hymenaeus and Philetus, whose heretical doctrines have, quote, spread like gangrene. Paul offers final guidance on how to deal with division in the church and encourages Timothy to trust that God will lead people to truth and away from the traps of the devil. The Epistle to Titus. This letter is a very short address to a man called Titus, who it appears is a disciple of Paul. It offers practical advice for leading a church on the island of Crete, including how different groups within the congregation should be taught. Paul emphasizes that good Christians are marked by discipline and obedience, and he then warns against the problem of false teaching and unhelpful arguments. The Epistle to Philemon. The final letter attributed to Paul is addressed to a man called Philemon, and it deals with a very specific situation. Paul is writing on behalf of a man called Onesimus, a runaway slave who once belonged to Philemon. It appears that Onesimus encountered Paul while on the run, and later became a Christian. Paul then appeals to Philemon to take him back, but not as a slave, instead as a fellow believer. Paul even offers to repay any debt Onesimus may have owed. It's fair.
So this is why you should believe in God. This is why you should never lose hope and lose your faith in the Almighty. And parents and grandparents should all teach their children that God is real. God is the Holy Spirit. Jesus is the Lord of all mankind. He came to earth to save our sins. So Jesus is a living soul that was among us and died on the cross to take away all our sins. And I beg of you, when someone is selling jumpers or figures or signs to celebrate God, please stop saying that God is a myth. Please stop saying that God does not exist. Because if you think that God does not exist and it's just a myth, that at the end of the day, in my way of thinking, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Because like Jesus said, you can only enter the kingdom of heaven if you go through me and keep your faith and believe that there is life after death in the kingdom of heaven. Thank you for listening.
I shouldn't even stand this close to you. I don't deserve to look your way. You were pierced for my transgressions, crushed because of me. The punishment that brought me peace was laid on you, not me. By your wounds I am healed, but I'm the one who made you bleed. I walked away, I chose my sin.
crushed for my sin. By his wounds I am healed. This love I don't deserve. He took my place on the cross so I could live again. Now I lift my